Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to go over with you today the poetic analysis of Psalm 121, where we're going to look at the types of parallelism that we see here. As you recall from the instructional video, there's essentially three basic types that we're looking for. We're going to look for synonymous lines, where one line essentially repeats the previous line. We're going to look for antithetical lines, where line A says one thing and line B says the opposite. And then we're going to look for synthetic relationships, where line A says X, and then the second line expands on that thought in some way beyond simple repetition or contrast. Again, the synonymous parallelism is essentially repeating the first line. Antithetical parallelism puts the lines in contrast. Synthetic has some other type of relationship. And again, if you've studied inductive Bible study, some of those structural relationships that we see, those rhetorical devices, can be used profitably to describe the relationship between the lines. So let's start. The first verse, and here we have two lines. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? As you can see, these two lines, it's not a simple repetition, nor is it a contrast. So this is an example of synthetic. And what's the relationship? Notice, I lift my eyes to the hills. And then what does that do? That leads the psalmist to ask a question: from where does my help come from? So in a sense, this is a causal movement. So this is essentially one that moves from cause to effect. The second line expands the first by giving a reaction to what came before. Okay, my help comes from Yahweh, who made heaven and earth. Again, what type of relationship is this? This is going to be another example of the synthetic. And notice that the second line more specifically describes who Yahweh is, the identity of Yahweh. So my help comes from Yahweh. Well, who is Yahweh? Who made heaven and earth. So in a sense, this moves from a general statement about who the helper is to more specifically what does it mean, or what can we say specifically about the identity of this helper. So we might call this a movement from the general to the particular. So I hope if you had any problems with this work so far, you can see kind of what the process is. In Psalm 121 has quite a bit of these synthetic forms in here, though we'll get to see other ones as well. Let's go on to verse 3. He will not let your feet be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. So we have then two lines describing, and all of the rest of the poem, in a sense, is flowing out of those first two verses. We know that the Lord is the helper. He's the maker of heaven and earth. And so the rest of the poem, in a sense, actually gives us particulars about how it is that Yahweh is the helper. So when you look at the IBS survey part of this, the first two verses are a general statement. The rest of this psalm particularizes. But now let's look at the poetry itself. He will not let your feet be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Now this is our first example of what would be synonymous parallelism versus synthetic. So synonymous. Verse 4, behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Okay, so we have two lines. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. So what have we done here? Again, this isn't simply repeating. It's not contrasting. What do we have? This is moving back to synthetic. So again, note for synonymous, I'm going S-Y-N-O-N, for synthetic S-Y-N. That's what I had done on the previous page as well. So we have an example of synthetic parallelism here, and what's going on. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. So in a sense, the second line really is just, again, filling out the first line. So line A, behold, he who keeps Israel. Well, what about that person? He will neither slumber nor sleep. So again, this is probably most easiest way to think of this as an expansion, or we would say a movement from the general, again, to the particular. Verse 5, Yahweh is your keeper. Yahweh is your shade on your right hand. Now, you could probably argue that this could be synonymous, but I would argue that it's probably more specifically synthetic again because of the expansion of the thought. So what does it mean that Yahweh is a keeper? More specifically, so we have this idea of a general idea moving to a particular idea. So line A is true here. And you might have noticed a couple other things when you did your IBS work. Notice how many times the word keep shows up. And again, if you're looking at the Hebrew, that word for keep, it shows up earlier. This is shamar. Over and over again, we have shamar. And now we also probably want to notice that the first time since verses 1 and 2, we have Yahweh's name comes back, and we're beginning now to see the psalm move towards a climax. So this would be another example of synthetic, though again, I could see why someone might argue that it's synonymous. I think it's more properly synthetic because you have this general to particular movement again. Verse 6, the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. This is a textbook example of what? Synonymous parallelism, right? Even down to the structure. And in fact, the second line even omits the verb because it's implied from the second. So this is a classic example of synonymous. And Yahweh will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. Yeah, I think this is most likely synonymous, again, because you basically have subject, will keep, and then you have an object in each case. In this case, it's a preposition. So this is another example of synonymous. And then the poem ends with an interesting construction. Again, depending on your English translation, this gets laid out a couple different ways. But if you look at the Hebrew, I think it's clearly three pieces. So this is our only example in Psalm 121. Instead of having 2 lines, we have 3 lines. And so it's line A, line B, and line C. And notice how this unfolds. Yahweh will keep, you're going out and you're coming in, from now or both now and forevermore. So we have a temporal phrase, we have a thing about motion, and we have the statement that the Lord is the one who's going to be watching over the persons that are moving essentially forever. So this would be an example of what would you say between the lines, synthetic again. And I think it's the same kind of movement that we've been seeing. We have general, and then we basically have 2 lines that give us particularization. This shows us kind of the how or the scope of, in terms of movement of God's people. The Lord will keep, you're going out and you're coming in, which pretty much takes up all the options for movement. And then also temporally, it's not just today or yesterday or tomorrow, it's now and forever. So this again would be a movement from general to the particulars. Now, and I did that quickly, so you can go back and rewind this and watch it, but observe, don't make this too difficult, right? The key things, if it's the lines simply repeat, which in classic example right here, and we didn't see an antithetical example, the lines simply repeated synonymous. If they would reverse, it would be antithetical. All the other ones would be synthetic. And if it's synthetic, you simply ask yourself, what does line B do in relation to what comes in front of it? And I think the easiest way then to make that label is just to think of like an IBS structure. As we saw lots of examples of essentially an expansion of an idea, which we'd call moving from a general really do a particular that gives it more flesh. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell, and it's really truly is my privilege to serve as your instructor this semester.